Joe never thought he'd have to defend his grandmother from a neighborhood enforcer. He grew up in a world where the elderly were respected, where neighbors helped each other shovel snow or bring in groceries, and where quiet streets meant peace, not hidden threats. But that idea of suburban serenity was shattered the day Karen put her hands on Grandma Joanne. Joanne was the kind of grandmother who wore flannel shirts and old police boots around the house. She didn't believe in excuses, never let Joe slack off in school, and still shot better than most cops at the range. She'd spent over 30 years as a patrol officer before retiring, and even in her 60s, her presence still had weight. But none of that mattered to Karen, the woman who ran the HOA like a private fiefdom. It started with a parking spot. Joe had pulled into a visitor space in front of his grandmother's townhouse, a perfectly legal move. But Karen stormed out of her Range Rover, as if he'd just parked across her front lawn. She screamed at him for breaking community code and demanded he move. Joe stood his ground, calmly explaining it was a visitor spot, and he wasn't violating anything. That's when Karen marched to the front door and pounded hard enough to rattle the storm glass. Joanne opened it. She barely had time to ask what the problem was before Karen shoved her, an open-palmed, body-weighted push that knocked the older woman into her storm door and sent her stumbling backwards into the frame. Joe was halfway down the steps by the time Joanne hit the floor, but neighbors were already gathering. Someone across the street had recorded it. Another neighbor yelled that he had seen the whole thing. Karen tried to spin it, claiming Joanne had attacked her, but the evidence was indisputable. The video, grainy but clear, spread like wildfire through the neighborhood Facebook group. Karen was cited by the police for assault. It should have ended there, but instead, it only escalated. The very next morning, Joanne received 3 violation notices taped to her front door. One was for unauthorized signage, because of a faded, "Welcome Friends" placard. Another claimed the weeds along her fence were too tall. The third cited excessive noise from Joe's car, despite the fact that Joe had only been there for an hour the day before and drove a hybrid. They knew what this was. It wasn't enforcement. It was retaliation. Karen wasn't acting alone. As the self-appointed HOA enforcer, she had built an entire infrastructure of compliance officers, neighbors turned spies, clipboard wielders empowered to report, fine, and intimidate anyone who got in the way. Joanne and Joe became her primary targets, but soon other stories surfaced. An elderly widower 2 streets over was fined $200 for a wreath. Out of season. A disabled veteran on the corner had his driveway painted with warning stripes after being accused of parking violations. Single mothers, retirees, immigrants, anyone who didn't fit Karen's definition of order was fair game. Joanne knew intimidation tactics when she saw them. She'd seen them used by criminals in bad neighborhoods, by bureaucrats hiding misconduct, and by power-hungry administrators in the department. But this was suburban tyranny under the guise of neighborhood rules. She did what she'd always done. She investigated. She kept records. She photographed every violation note, every citation, and every piece of vandalism. When her tires were slashed, she didn't panic. She filed a report. When her mailbox was dented in the night, she documented it. When Joe's windows were smeared with Vaseline, she installed motion cameras. Sandra, her next-door neighbor, and an old friend from her academy days, joined in. Sandra had spent years in internal affairs and had an eye for patterns. Together, they combed through HOA documentation and noticed something odd. The violation letters sent out weren't all on HOA letterhead, and some bore signatures of people who weren't listed as current board members. One document was signed by someone who had moved out over a year ago. Joe, meanwhile, took to researching Karen herself. A quick online dive revealed she wasn't just an overzealous neighbor. She was also a campaign donor to a city councilman named Richard Belmonte. He had recently pushed through legislation expanding the legal authority of HOAs to fine and foreclose with less oversight. Joe found a property record indicating Karen had purchased a house in the neighborhood at half its market value through a distress sale from a resident who'd racked up over $4,000 in HOA fines. That resident now lived in a nursing facility. The dots began to connect. They brought this to a local journalist, Eva Santiago, whose investigative pieces on municipal corruption had already earned her a reputation in city circles. Eva listened. She asked questions. Then she asked for copies. Within weeks, she was knocking on doors herself, gathering interviews, taking photos of damaged mailboxes, and documenting HOA meeting minutes that no longer matched the public record. Eva's first article ran under the headline, HOA from Hell, When Community Rules Turn into Weapons. It detailed Joanne's assault, the escalation of violations, and testimonies from at least 7 residents who claimed they were either intimidated into selling their homes or fined until they felt forced to leave. The article went viral locally. Then the threat started. Someone poured bleach on Sandra's garden. Joanne's front windows were shattered with marbles from a slingshot. Joe's car was egged 3 times in a week. Still, they pressed on. Eva published a second piece, this one more explosive. It named Belmonte directly, revealing campaign contributions from HOA funds funneled through shell donations in homeowners' names. Elderly residents had no idea they were listed as political donors until Eva showed them the public filings. Karen, it turned out, was more than a bully. She was a cog in a machine designed to siphon equity from vulnerable homeowners and reroute it to political war chests. Joanne handed the evidence to an old lieutenant of hers, now working with the district attorney's office. Quietly, he opened a formal investigation. Karen was arrested within a month, charged with assault, harassment, fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. News stations ran the story on a loop, her mugshot plastered beside a split screen of the video showing her shoving Joanne. Community members, who had stayed silent, now came forward. One man had been threatened with foreclosure over a late HOA payment of just $78. A widow said she was offered cash for keys at a price nearly 60% below market, then threatened when she declined. The story snowballed. Pressure mounted on Councilman Belmonte, as Eva's reports dug deeper into the financials. Subpoenas followed. A grand jury was convened. Joanne never celebrated. That wasn't her style. But one evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops and the windows finally stayed whole, she looked out over her lawn where neighbors gathered to talk. Not whisper, not worry, and said, "Told you they picked the wrong granny." The silence that followed Karen's arrest was not peace. It was the eye of the storm. Joanne knew better than to believe the fight was over. She had spent a lifetime studying how power protected itself, how those who pull strings rarely appear on the stage. And she could sense it, that Belmonte wasn't going to go down without dragging the whole boardroom with him. Still, the neighborhood began to breathe again. People who had stayed hidden in their homes started stepping out, offering help, stories, and, for the first time, their names. One elderly couple from across the park admitted they'd been paying monthly compliance fees for years without ever knowing what violations they were supposedly addressing. A young mother described how her child's tricycle had been confiscated from their front yard for violating visual harmony standards. The more people spoke, the more it became clear. The HOA had been running a scheme of weaponized civility, a perfectly suburban form of extortion. Eva's reporting took on a life of its own. She connected the dots between Karen and a network of other HOA enforcers across the city, all sharing the same lawyer, the same obscure property management firm, and most damningly, the same financial backer, a development pack fronted by Councilman Belmonte. Her third article, "The Equity Harvesters," was less a news piece and more an indictment. It showed how distressed homeowners, especially seniors, were being targeted by coordinated enforcement patterns, pressured into selling, and replaced by buyers linked to Belmonte's donors. When the DA's office finally raided the HOA's office, located inside a strip mall storefront that looked more like a dentist's waiting room than the nerve center of a criminal enterprise, they found boxes of documents, burner phones, and a trove of sealed records labeled Acquisition Watch List. Joanne read the inventory list and found at least a dozen addresses in her own community marked for flip priority. Her home was among them. Joe took it personally. He had always viewed Joanne's house as a sanctuary, a place of stories, discipline, and warmth. He remembered learning to ride his bike in the cul-de-sac, Joanne cheering with coffee in hand. To see that memory almost stolen, reduced to a data point in someone's corruption, filled him with a rage he hadn't known before. But his grandmother reminded him, as she always had, "We don't fight with fire. We fight with facts. Keep your hands clean and your back straight." So Joe put his energy into organizing. He and Sandra began holding community workshops on homeowner rights. They handed out pamphlets printed from the resource center Eva had helped fund with her article earnings. They taught people how to read their HOA bylaws, how to challenge a fine, how to request meeting records legally. Within weeks, they'd gone from whispered complaints to full-scale neighborhood mobilization. Joanne, meanwhile, kept pushing from the inside. She attended the special hearings organized by the DA's office, gave sworn testimony against Karen and the HOA board, and connected residents with legal advocates. Her years on the force lent her credibility, but it was her persistence that made her the neighborhood's anchor. When a former HOA treasurer came forward and offered whistleblower documents in exchange for immunity, he said it was because that old cop lady made me realize I was still human. The charges against Karen expanded to include mail fraud, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Her bail was revoked after investigators uncovered she had tried to intimidate a witness through a third party. Meanwhile, Belmonte's name was now under heavy scrutiny. Eva's most damning revelation came through an anonymous source, a ledger showing cash transactions that tied Belmonte to at least 4 HOA-linked flips, where homes were bought under duress and resold for massive profits by LLCs connected to his campaign fund. City Hall began to fracture under the weight of the scandal. Public outcry grew loud enough to force a city audit of all council member donations and their ties to HOAs. Belmonte, once a rising star known for streamlining suburban order, was now a symbol of how small governance could be twisted into private empire building. And all the while, the neighborhood transformed. No longer frozen by fear, people began reclaiming what had always been theirs. Kids rode bikes freely again. Neighbors held cookouts on shared lawns without the threat of citation. The once dreaded monthly HOA meetings were now open, democratic gatherings hosted at the community center, run by an interim board made up of volunteers who had lived through the worst of the corruption and were committed to transparency. On one particularly sunny Saturday, a group of teens painted over the faded and old loitering signs at the community playground and replaced them with a new banner. "All neighbors welcome." Joanne stood nearby with Sandra, watching them work. She didn't smile often, but that day she did. "You think we've really won?" Sandra asked her. Joanne shrugged, then replied, "We've won enough to rest for now. But we keep our boots by the door." Joe, standing a few feet away, had never felt more proud. What started as an attack on his grandmother had become something much bigger, a reckoning, a realignment, a reclamation. The battle had cost them all something, time, sleep, security, but it had also given them back what mattered more: dignity, trust, solidarity. Eva's final article in the series wasn't an expose, it was a portrait, titled, "The House That Stood." It chronicled Joanne's journey from victim to vanguard, casting her not as a hero, but as a neighbor, stubborn, decent, and unwilling to bow. The photo accompanying it showed Joanne, Joe, and Sandra standing on the porch, arms crossed, the sun setting behind them like an amber badge of honor. Justice doesn't always feel like a dramatic courtroom scene or a gavel slamming down with finality. Sometimes, justice feels like silence, the absence of fear, the calm that returns to a street once haunted by intimidation. That's what Joanne, Joe, and their neighbors experienced in the days after Karen's arrest and the subsequent media firestorm. But this victory had been earned through relentless courage, not convenience. The real triumph wasn't just in the headlines or the handcuffs. It was in the small, slow rebuilding of a fractured community. Karen's arrest did more than remove one aggressive HOA enforcer from power. It punctured the myth of invincibility that had cloaked the HOA and its backers for years. Residents, who had once lived under a cloud of vague violations, silent retaliation, and fear of losing their homes suddenly found their voices. With the immediate threat neutralized, people began talking. Stories began surfacing that no one had dared to tell before. One by one, neighbors came forward. Ms. Dolores, a soft-spoken 79-year-old widow, revealed that her house had been quietly auctioned off while she was recovering from hip surgery, all because of fines she never even saw. A disabled war veteran named Hank recounted how his front access ramp was removed by the HOA for aesthetic noncompliance, leaving him housebound for weeks until a friend helped him replace it at night. A single mother, Rebecca, shared how her mailbox was vandalized repeatedly after she refused to pay non-compliance fees that had no documentation behind them. These weren't just petty grievances, they were systematic abuses designed to break people down. As the stories piled up, Eva, the journalist who had first broken the story, published a follow-up series titled The Broken Neighborhood. Her reporting highlighted how the HOA board, under Karen's leadership, had collaborated with a shady property management company tied to Richard Belmonte, the city councilman with ambitions for higher office. The money trail showed fines being collected, properties foreclosed under dubious circumstances, and kickbacks moving through dummy shell corporations that funded Belmonte's campaigns. It was a racket, sophisticated, cruel, and profitable. Eva's investigation caught the attention of state attorneys. Belmonte's name, once uttered with deference in local political circles, now became a liability. Investigators raided the HOA office, seized files, and uncovered doctored violation letters, forged signatures, and even internal memos detailing tactics to pressure elderly homeowners into selling. The public was shocked. What had started as a neighborhood parking dispute had cracked open a much bigger scandal. Through it all, Joanne remained the quiet anchor. She didn't want parades or press interviews. Her background as a retired police officer had taught her to do the job and move on. But deep down, this wasn't just about her badge or her past, it was about dignity. About refusing to be broken, no matter how much pressure was applied. Her front yard became a symbol. Where once there had been an HOA-issued citation taped to her mailbox, now there was a small flag with the words, "Not for sale." Joe, inspired by everything they had uncovered, launched a nonprofit called Neighbor Watchlight. It started as a Facebook group offering homeowners advice on navigating HOA disputes, but quickly evolved into a statewide network providing legal referrals, document reviews, and educational workshops. His first workshop drew 5 people. His 10th had 50. Before long, media outlets were calling him a housing justice activist, a label that amused him, but also gave him purpose. He wasn't trying to be a hero, he just wanted to make sure no one else's grandma had to endure what his did. Sandra, too, found herself more involved than ever. She started organizing neighborhood potlucks and weekend cleanups, trying to reconnect the people who had lived in fear and isolation for too long. Her kindness, her steady warmth, helped bridge old wounds. Some people, especially those who had once backed Karen or remained silent, felt ashamed. Sandra didn't ask for apologies. She simply invited them to the next event and said, "Let's start fresh." In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly began to change, not in architecture or landscape, but in atmosphere. Where once there was suspicion, now there was shared laughter. People helped repaint fences together. They checked on each other after storms. They shared holiday lights and lemonade in the summer. It wasn't a fairy tale. Disputes still happened, people still grumbled, but now they were addressed with honesty, not threats. The HOA board, under state supervision, was dissolved and restructured. The new board, elected by the community through open ballots, operated with full transparency. Meetings were public, budgets posted online, and decisions made collectively. When the indictment against Belmonte was finally handed down, it was a quiet day. No one celebrated with fanfare. Joanne simply turned off the television and made a cup of tea. It wasn't that she didn't care, it was that she had already moved beyond him. The real villain had never just been Belmonte or Karen. It had been the system that allowed their behavior to fester, unchecked power, silent neighbors, loopholes in law, and fear. That's what she had fought, and that's what they were finally beginning to dismantle. Still, healing isn't linear. Joanne still had nightmares. Loud noises still made her flinch. Joe still watched her a little too closely sometimes, worried when she got quiet. But there were also moments of light. Like when little kids in the neighborhood would run up to her and say, "Thanks for saving our street." Or when Dolores, the widow, brought over peach cobbler just to say hello. Or when a letter came in the mail, not from a lawyer or an official, but from someone named Marcus, a man in another state who had read about her story and was now fighting his own HOA. "You gave me the courage to speak up," it said. On the 1-year anniversary of the block party, the neighborhood hosted another celebration. This time, it wasn't about marking a battle. It was about honoring how far they had come. Joanne sat in her usual lawn chair, now repainted and cushioned, under a shade tent. Joe grilled hot dogs, and Sandra handed out homemade lemonade. Neighbors danced, kids chased bubbles, and the street echoed with music instead of silence. At one point, Eva asked Joanne if she'd ever thought this was how things would turn out. Joanne looked around, at the homes, the families, the lights strung across fences, and said, "No, but I hoped." Because in the end, hope was what held everything together. Hope that speaking up mattered. Hope that people could change. Hope that neighborhoods weren't just about property lines, but about people. This story, rooted in one grandmother's refusal to bow down to injustice, had become more than a local news item. It had become a movement. A message to every resident, every neighbor, every person facing quiet oppression. You are not alone. You have a voice. And when voices rise together, no amount of red tape or intimidation can hold them back forever. The road to justice isn't always paved. Sometimes it's cracked and uneven, full of potholes and detours. But it's still worth walking. Step by step, block by block, Joe, Sandra, and their community didn't just win a legal battle. They reclaimed their street, their peace, and their power. And in doing so, they lit a path for others.